In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union with tanks, artillery, and aircraft. They carried the Mauser Kar-98K rifle, supported by MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, and backed by the terrifying 88mm guns. At first, the Red Army could not stop them. Stalin had purged many of his officers, his armies were scattered, and German panzer divisions advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. Entire Soviet units surrendered. Cities fell. German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels told his people that victory was certain. Even Winston Churchill, though no friend of communism, feared Moscow would fall. Yet the Soviet Union was vast, and its people refused to give in. German supply lines stretched thin, and as the first Russian winter set in, the invaders faced snow, ice, and a growing resistance. The tide would not turn immediately, but the seeds of German defeat were already being planted. By 1942, Hitler focused on the south. He wanted oil fields in the Caucasus, and a symbolic victory in the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. The battle that followed became one of the bloodiest in history. German troops stormed the city with artillery, Stuka dive bombers, and MG-42 fire. Soviet defenders fought for every house and factory. The PPSH-41 submachine gun, cheap to make and deadly in close quarters, became the Soviet soldiers' weapon of choice. Snipers with Mosin-Nagant rifles turned ruins into hunting grounds. Whole families starved, froze, and died, but the defense held. In November 1942, General Zhukov launched a massive counterattack called Operation Uranus. Soviet T-34 tanks, supported by artillery and infantry, struck the German flanks. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Hitler ordered them to hold, promising relief. But relief never came. By February 1943, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. More than 300,000 German troops were lost. It was the first time an entire German army had been destroyed. The myth of invincibility was shattered, and the Red Army had proven it could win. The next year brought the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank clash in history. The Germans hoped to regain the initiative with new Tiger and Panther tanks and their dreaded 88mm guns. The Soviets prepared deep defenses, mines, trenches, and artillery lines. When the Germans attacked in July 1943, they met walls of fire. Soviet T-34s, supported by Katyusha rocket launchers, absorbed the blows and struck back. The result was a decisive Soviet victory. After Kursk, the Red Army would never again retreat on a major front. From that point forward, the push west began. The drive across Eastern Europe was brutal. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, Soviet soldiers fought through cities reduced to rubble. Villages burned, civilians suffered, and entire landscapes were scarred. Yet the Red Army kept advancing. Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, worked with Churchill and later Eisenhower to keep the uneasy alliance alive. Supplies from the West arrived in convoys, bringing trucks, food, and even American-made weapons. But the bulk of the fighting in the East was borne by Soviet troops, millions of them, armed with PPSH-41s, Mosin-Nagants, and supported by artillery and tanks. By 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that destroyed Germany's Army Group Center. It was one of the most devastating defeats the Wehrmacht ever suffered. German defenses collapsed, and the Red Army advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. As they moved west, they uncovered the horrors of concentration camps and the brutality of Nazi occupation. For Soviet soldiers, the war was no longer only about survival. It was also about vengeance. Through Hungary, Romania, and into the Balkans, the Red Army pressed on. In Finland, Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim fought desperately to preserve his nation's independence, balancing between Germany and the Soviet Union. In Poland, uprisings broke out, sometimes supported and sometimes abandoned by advancing Soviet forces. The political games of Stalin and Molotov shaped not only battles, but the future of Europe. By early 1945, the road to Berlin lay open. The final assault was a storm of men and machines. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Thousands of guns fired in unison, creating a thunder heard miles away. Soviet tanks rolled forward. Infantry swarmed the streets, and the Luftwaffe could do little to stop them. Hitler, hiding in his bunker, raged and gave impossible orders. Goebbels still preached about final victory, but his words meant nothing. The end was inevitable. The fighting for Berlin was savage. German troops, including boys armed with Panzerfausts, tried to resist. MG-42s rattled from street corners, but the Red Army overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. House by house, block by block, the Soviets closed in. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. A few days later, the city surrendered. On May 9th, the Soviet Union celebrated Victory Day. Red banners flew over the Reichstag. Stalin proclaimed the triumph of socialism, while Molotov declared justice had been done. For soldiers who had marched from Stalingrad to Berlin, it was the end of a nightmare and the proof of their resilience. The cost had been staggering. More than 20 million Soviet citizens were dead. Entire cities were erased. The PPH-41, the Mosin Nagant, the T-34, the Katyusha, all became symbols not only of war, but of sacrifice. The Red Army had risen from near collapse to absolute victory, and in doing so, it had broken the back of Nazi Germany. From Stalingrad's frozen ruins to Berlin's burning streets, the Red Army's rise was a story of suffering, endurance, and relentless determination. It showed the world that even in the darkest moments, when defeat seemed certain, an army and a nation could turn the tide. And that is how the Red Army marched to victory, ending the war in Europe and forever changing the course of history.